So, guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen. Bonsoir, cher Denis. Good evening, everybody. I'm happy to welcome you to our lecture tonight. Denis Ribouillault de Montréal, au Canada, will talk on gardens and their sundials in the early modern period. And he will deal with two case studies, the Villa Barbaro a Mazere and Villa Madama in Rome. This lecture is the last in our series Alle Zeiten, alle Länder, die Welt und Natur im Garten, all times, all countries, the world and nature in the garden. The lecture series started in January with a colloquium on aviaries, went on in May, and last week went on with our symposium on Friedrich Ludwig von Sckell, the creator of the English garden in Munich. And today, as I told you, it's on sundials, neglected topic, as well as aviaries. Denis Ribouillault has been professor of art history at the Université de Montréal since 2011. He obtained his PhD at Université Paris 1 in 2006, and he held numerous fellowships in Florence at Villa Itati as a pensionnaire of the Academy of France, at Villa Medici in Rome, at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., and in many other international institutions. His dissertation and numerous of his books and articles deal with villas and gardens, mainly in Italy, with the relation between architecture and the landscape, and generally with viewing and perceiving landscape and nature. His last publication, which has just appeared just a few days ago, is the Villa Barbaro at Mazere, Science, Philosophy, and the Family in Venetian Renaissance Art. Let's welcome him for his lecture on sundials.
Thank you very much. So good evening. Thank you for being there. Thank you for people following on Zoom. So first of all, I would like to thank my colleague and friend, Iris Lauterbach, for her invitation to speak here today. And secondly, I would like to apologize for not speaking in German, but I guess you're used to speaking English now in Germany very much. So I will read my text in English as clearly as possible. I'll speak for about an hour, but I have made a very rich PowerPoint to help you follow me in this little journey in the heavenly villas and gardens of the Italian Renaissance. I begin. The cultural and material analysis of early modern villas and their gardens can benefit from the study of objects and themes that have been neglected by modern scholarship. And this is the case of the sundials that adorn many early modern European gardens and that I discuss in my forthcoming books, Gardens of the Heavens. So that's not the Villa Barbaro, that's another one. On sundials, Gardens of the Heavens, Astronomy and Cosmology in Early Modern European Gardens. Displaced, destroyed, broken, forgotten, these fragile objects have suffered much at the hands of time. An interesting twist of fate, perhaps, for instruments whose main function was to remind the owners of the villas and their guests that life was short, that fate was often capricious. And this is at least how the poet Antonio Cattaneo described a floral sundial, now long gone. Can't see it on that picture, of course. Absolutely. So this is a sundial you cannot see, but in a villa that looked like that. We have its description in a poem published in 1680, which emphasizes the ephemeral and fragile nature of life. On the green lines of the famous garden, the sun, bright Archimedes, measures the day, and a clock made of grass shows that man, like the fragile grass, decays. He does not last. It's much nicer in Italian, of course. A few years earlier, Fulvio Testi had also described this sundial made of scented herbs with the same tragic élan. Testi also marveled at the fact that this ingenious sundial could tell the time as accurately as a sundial painted on a wall. He testified to the dual quality of garden sundials as both astronomical instruments and works of art, objects of mathematical wonder, but also bearers of a moral and poetic dimension. So in this book, I study several remarkable sundials in famous gardens: Villa Giulia in Rome, the Jesuit garden of Sant'Andrea del Quirinale, still in Rome, the nearby papal Villa del Quirinale, Villa Borghese, Villa Aldobrandini at Frascati, the Medici Villa at Pratolino, where the main staircases functioned as sundials. There's an article coming out in a couple of days about this. The Hortus Palatinus in Heidelberg, of course, John Evelyn's dial garden at Sayce Court and others in England, Le Jardin des Tuileries in Paris, or in Germany, for instance, Johann Christoph Volkhammer's garden in Nuremberg. But today, however, I'm only going to show you two examples. And this is because my interest is not so much in the sundials themselves, although they are fascinating objects that attracted a great deal of attention in the early modern period. Rather, I'm interested in what their presence tells us about Gartenkultur, villa and garden culture, and especially how they relate to the other artifacts and images found in the villa and its gardens. Indeed, their study allows us to recover a certain vision of villa and garden culture that has been largely ignored by previous studies, namely its connection, so not only with the larger landscape and the natural world, but also with the cosmos at large. Furthermore, all garden sundials do not tell the same stories. Today, I focus on two famous villa gardens that show a particular concern for the environment and the heavens, and that are largely linked to the patron's belief in astral magic. That is, the belief that the planets and the stars exert their influence, for good or ill, on everything on Earth, and that it is possible to harness such power. We will first look at the Villa Medici in Rome, known as Villa Madama, built from 1518 for Pope Leo X and Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, later Pope Clement VII. Then we will go about 60 kilometers north of Rome to visit the Villa Farnese at Caprarola, built between 1559 and 1575 for Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. These are, of course, very, very famous Italian villas. But before I begin to describe these places and these forgotten objects, it is important to point out briefly the specific cultural context in which these two villas were conceived. In both cases, beside being hugely powerful people, the patrons were deeply indebted to the philosophico-medical thinking developed in Florence in the late Quattrocento, particularly by Marsilio Ficino. Ficino, like Leonardo da Vinci and every natural philosopher with him, established a strict correspondence between man and the world, microcosm and macrocosm. As the son of a doctor, he also insisted on the body's dependence on its environment in line with Hippocratic theories. The right balance of humors or temperaments, especially according to the seasons, was considered essential. Above all, it was necessary to avoid polluted air, a carrier of disease. These medical concepts, inherited from antiquity from Galen and Hippocrates, were at the heart of Renaissance architectural theories on villas and gardens. In the De Re Edificatoria, Leon Battista Alberti devotes long passages to the choice of location for the villa in relation to the climate, humidity, sun, and the wind, and the geomorphology of the place. Elevated sites on hillsides were considered particularly suitable, as in the case of Villa Medici and Villa Farnese. In Book 9, referring to the garden of the suburban villa, Alberti writes, quote, "Doctors recommend that we enjoy the freest and purest air possible, and this can undeniably be provided by a villa situated in an elevated and isolated position." End of quote. The villa, therefore, with its pure air, maintains good health, brings infinite pleasure. It is, I quote Alberti again, exposed to a cheerful and luminous atmosphere, receiving light, sunshine, and healthy air in abundance. Other theorists of the villa, such as Bartolomeo Taeggio, also point out the optical virtues of the greenery in the garden. Quote, "Wherever you are, you see very cheerful greenery, which not only entertains the eye and awakens the intellect, but also comforts and is particularly suited to the eye." End of quote. And the same goes for the sense of smell. Quote, "Green living plants not only enhance the sense of sight, but through the fragrance they give off, do much to help the human vital spirit, pneuma or spiritus." All these prescriptions, which actually are very common in Renaissance literature, testify to the belief in the therapeutic effects of the garden and find an explanation in the medical theories of the time. But this view was developed in particular in Marsilio Ficino's De Vita Triplici, a work from 1489 that proposes rules to ensure a long and healthy life, free from illness and melancholy, and protected from the harmful influence of Saturn. One should, Ficino writes, avoid hot, over ice, or cloudy air, but seek temperate and clear air. We recommend frequent observations of bright waters, the colors green and red, and pleasant walks in gardens and woods. End of quote. And it is also essential, Ficino writes, to expose oneself to the beneficial rays of Jupiter, Venus, and above all, the sun. For him, a walk in the garden, the use of the garden daily, was the place par excellence for such an astral cure. And this passage is quite interesting. As often as possible, one should walk among plants with a delicate scent. In fact, all herbs, flowers, trees, and fruits have an odor, even if we are often barely aware of it. And it is through this odor, which is practically the breath and spirit of the life of the world, that they revive and invigorate you in every way. That is, through your spirit, spiritus, whose nature is very close to such odors, and through the spirit, the mediator between body and soul, they easily restore the body and admirably satisfy the soul. You should walk among these plants in the open air for quite a long time during the day in high, serene, and temperate regions. In this way, the purer rays of the sun and the stars will easily reach you from all sides. So in addition to the use of these therapeutic gardens, the painted versions of which were also effective, as Alberti recalls, for instance, Ficino recommended the contemplation of other specific objects and images from which beneficial astral influences could also be drawn, what he calls imagines astronomicae. And these had a talismanic power and worked effectively to direct heavenly and divine forces. For instance, Ficino recommends contemplating astronomical images painted on vaults and models of the universe, such as celestial spheres. And he even gives specific examples like Archimedes' sphere. Quote, "It will be useful to look at a sphere equipped with its own motions. Archimedes once constructed one, and a Florentine friend of ours named Lorenzo did so just recently." So what is he mentioning here with this Lorenzo is a famous planetary clock built and devised by the Florentine clockmaker Lorenzo della Volpaia. A splendid version of this device was built slightly later in 1510 for Lorenzo de' Medici. According to Stéphane Toussaint, for Ficino, Volpaia's clock offered both an instrument and rapture as a miniaturized model of the animated sky, and this provided a highly favorable vehicle for the ecstatic contemplation of the world soul. So it is not an object in the way we understand objects nowadays, really. It has some talismanic properties. And it is within this astrological medical culture, which I here very briefly summarized, that one must situate the sumptuous gardens and decorations that will now interest us. And I begin with the Villa Madama in Rome. Situated on Monte Mario, overlooking Rome and the Tiber Valley, the Villa Madama was designed by Raphael and Antonio da San Gallo the Younger around 1518-19 for Pope Leo X and his cousin Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, who then became Pope Clement VII. Yvonne Elette kindly drew my attention a few years ago to a document in the so-called Codice Barberiano 3089 of the Vatican Library, which mentions the presence at Villa Madama of a sundial dated 1516. First published by Rodolfo Lanciani at the end of the 19th century, this document is part of an anonymous late 16th description of Rome. It reads, I give you the Italian, "Nel giardino già detto dei Medici, sopra un posamento in piano, sta di marmo bianchissimo, orologio da sole, di 3 palmi o quasi, orologium at latitudinem gradum 42, fabricatum Florenzie Prociovitate Romana, anno domini 1516, 1516. Queste attorno dove ancora l'arme papale di pale e l'impresa delle 3 pene col diamante." I will explain. In the early 20th century, Thomas Ashby first mistook this marble horologium for the famous planetary clock I just mentioned, designed and built by Lorenzo della Volpaia. A bit later, Pietro Romano suggested the sundial was located in the Villa Medici, but on the Pincian Hill. But there is no mention of a sundial of this type in the rich documentation available on the Villa Medici, and of course, the early date of 1516 and the mention of Leo X's impresa make Villa Madama a more logical candidate. Made in Florence, the sundial is designed for the latitude of Rome, which obviously points to the papal court of Leo X. Now, who could have supplied the Medici with such an instrument? Well, it is hard to say without more relevant documentation. However, we can note that a famous Florentine clockmaker, Bernardo della Volpaia, close to both Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, was active in Rome in those years. He was the son of Lorenzo della Volpaia, the head of this family renowned for its elaborate clock, sundials, and mathematical instrument, and closely associated with the Medici. Bernardo worked in the circle of Antonio da San Gallo and lived between 1517 and 1521 in a house rented by the owner of Villa Madama, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici. Whilst in Rome, Bernardo della Volpaia drew an ancient Roman sundial, then in the Della Valle collection. You can see here that also Hermann Postumus included it in his famous painting of 1536, Tempus edax rerum. Here, the sundial is clearly a symbol of the passage of time. a meditation really on the ruin and the decay of Rome and the passing of time. But Bernardo's drawing of this Menologium Vallense was in fact to be used to design a modern replica for another famous garden, the Orti Orricellari in Florence for Bernardo Rucellai. And this shows that it was fashionable to decorate one's garden with an elaborate all'antica sundial. Another possible candidate for the making of the Pope's sundial is Bernardo's brother, Benvenuto della Volpaia, who was also working in Rome as early as 1516. According to our document, the sundial of Villa Madama was made of marble and mounted on a pedestal. It is not clear whether the measurements given in the document, 3 palmi, about 67 centimeters, correspond to the circumference of the sundial or to its height, and I'm inclined to the latter. For comparison, the magnificent polyhedral sundial that I discovered a few years ago at Villa Giulia, made for Pope Julius III, is about the same size, 62 centimeters, also made of marble and mounted on a pedestal. So, I mean, I cannot say that the Villa Madama sundial looked like this, but it's a freestanding one. It's pretty much the same dimension, so we can have an idea of the typology of this forgotten and, of course, sundial that I've not been able to find anywhere. Concerning the location of this sundial, the anonymous author states that it was placed near l'Arme Bapale di Palle e l'Imprese delle Tre Pene col Diamante. And this seems to describe the ceiling of the so-called Sala di Giulio Romano, where the Medici shield is prominently displayed and the Impresa of the diamond with the 3 feathers is depicted all around. While awaiting more relevant documentation on its exact location, we can, for the moment, indicate how well the sundial fits into the overall iconography of the villa. In one of the earliest sources on the genesis of Villa Madama, the long Latin poem written in 1519 by Francesco Sperullo, most of the great cosmological themes formulated in the Florence of the Medici were adapted for the new Roman environment of the Pope. And these included the idea of the cosmos, Cosimo and the cosmos, and of course, the return of the Golden Age. Medici astrological references emphasizing the stars, the sun, and the globe appear throughout the text. Sperullo describes the villa itself as controlling the seasons and even the hours, protecting its inhabitants from unhealthy air. I quote, "Here winter is warm and summer cool. Here changes of season are not felt, and as the house shall intend, it will be ruled by hours running backwards. Here no one should shiver at the pestilential blowing of the damp south wind. The hospitable Vatican Hill will block its raging storm and swallow up its poison in the rise of its ridge." End of quote. This passage, where the Vatican Hill acts as a protection against the evils of unhealthy air, confirms the general attention paid by the designer of the villa to sunlight, views, and orientation in general, following the recommendation by Alberti and others that I mentioned earlier. According to this early program, it's not a program, but it's the first indications of a program. The later decoration of the Villa Madama mainly revolved around solar imagery. Claudia Cerivia has noted that the iconography of the Great Loggia, inspired by the recently rediscovered Domus Aurea, recalls Ovid's description of the Palace of the Sun in Book 3 of the Metamorphoses. In the central dome, we can see the 4 seasons, the 4 elements, the hours, the 7 planetary gods, and Diana of Ephesus as goddess of nature. In the loggia, many details of the stucco decoration playfully evoke Medici heraldry and solar symbolism. Here I show you these golden rays of the sun emanating from a lion's mouth, the lions being identified with Leo X. And of course, in the Sala Grande, painted by Giulio Romano and Giovanni da Udine, 1521-23, Apollo Sun and Dia Moon are depicted on the ceiling with the chariots revolving around the Medici coat of arms. Look here, the 6 Medici balls represent the Earth and the 5 planets, an analogy which would be later developed, for instance, at Palazzo Pitti in Florence. So if the sundial was located nearby, the thematic link between the instrument and the room could not have been more eloquent. And of course, there is this architecture. Several scholars have proposed that the circular courtyard and the circular garden documented in a drawing by Raphael could also be read as further references to this Medicean palle and the cosmic symbolism associated with it. Less discussed is the hippodrome in the gardens projected by Raphael, as well as being mentioned as a feature of Pliny's villa at Tusculum. The hippodrome recalls ancient games dedicated to the sun and is fundamentally linked to the cults of the sun and the moon. If the gardens had been completed according to such a plan, it would have provided an immediate echo of Giulio Romano's oval ceiling decoration with Apollo Sun and Diana Moon racing in their chariot, a cosmic image of the passage of time. And Raphael also imagined a room, the so-called diaetta, located on one of the villa's tower, the one next to the hanging garden. And this was to serve as a solarium and an observatory, following once again Pliny's description of his ancient villa. I'll give you the quote: "The diaetta is a circular structure. It is lit through a ring of glass windows, each of which is successively visited by the sun from the time it rises until it sets. Plain glass being no hindrance, as your lordship knows, it will follow that the room is made exceedingly agreeable by the constant sunshine and the panorama of town and country." And so this is exactly the kind of studiolo-like room where the villa owner could benefit from a positive effect of the environment, physically, physiologically, positive effect from the sun, from the stars, and ward off the melancholy caused by excessive study and the worries of political life. And then there is the elephant. The beautiful Fontana dell'Elefante by Giovanni da Udine, which adorns the hanging garden, must also be linked to the cosmic iconography of the villa, because the animal was then directly linked to astrology. Pliny the Elder, in book 8 of his Natural History, everybody read that book, says that the elephant, quote, has a religious respect for the stars and a veneration for the sun and the moon. Alexander the Great had dedicated his favorite elephant to the sun. And in the 17th century, Pope Alexander VII would have a monument erected by Bernini that would materialize this concept, the obelisk on the elephant's back, symbolizing the divine rays of the sun. And of course, you know that Bernini's elephant owes a lot to the elephant you find in the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili of Francesco Colonna. Relying on Pliny and other ancient sources, the Pope's astrologer, Piero Valeriano, wrote in his Hieroglyphica that the elephant was a symbol of piety and religion, a view still held in Cesare Ripa's Iconologia. At Villa Madama, this religious and cosmic significance of the elephant was reinforced by the almost personal relationship that Pope Leo developed with the famous elephant Hano. Sure, you've heard about Hano. Given to him in 1514 by King Manuel of Portugal and the model for the fountainhead at Villa Madama. In a drawing dated around 1539, Francesco de Holanda reproduced the memorial fresco that Raphael designed after the animal's death in 1516, with the epitaph supposedly written by the Pope himself. And in this image, Hano is clearly associated with the sun and the moon, represented in the upper left corner. Again, in a satirical pseudo-testament composed after the elephant's death, the animal himself commends his soul to the sun, which rises to worship each day. Hanno the elephant reappears in the astrological context of Sigismondo Fanti's Trionfo di Fortuna, published in Venice in the same year, 1526, and dedicated to Clement VII. Within the complex mathematical astrological system that Fanti developed in this Book of Fortune, the elephant is associated with the Casa dei Medici, and Clement VII, you can see him, appears depicted on the same page as the Ruota del Liofante. Interestingly, the elephant depicted at the center of the wheel comes directly from Raphael's drawing of the animal, a copy of which is still preserved in Berlin. The ubiquitous cosmic iconography of Villa Madama is, of course, a perfect reflection of the interests and beliefs of the Medici popes. As members of the Medici family, both Leo X and Clement VII made the sun, astrology, and time, and the return of time, the central elements of their imagery and propaganda. As Janet Cox-Rerick has amply demonstrated, Leo X identified with Apollo, sun, and I'm only showing you here this medal, but there's loads of material, of course, that Cox-Rerick has covered and on which there is no need to go back. Leo X was a pupil of Marsilio Ficino. He had a strong interest in astrology, was passionate about mathematics and astronomy, and also he played a very important role in the debate on the reform of the calendar during the Fifth Lateran Council, took place between 1512 and 1517. We can see the interest for the measure of time at the court of Leo X in the borders of the magnificent tapestries commissioned from Raphael by the Pope around 1515 to decorate the Sistine Chapel. You can see the fate, the seasons, Apollo and Diana, the hours, a very complex program, but also several time measuring devices and celestial globes. And also, it was during Leo X's pontificate that we have these two very important astrological ceiling decoration. So the one that you've heard about at the Villa Farnesina for Agostino Chigi, and this one in the Sala dei Pontefici at the Vatican. Now, the specialists of astrology that have studied this fresco, especially, think that this room functioned as a talismanic imago astronomica in the Ficinian sense. The closed universe created for the Pope in this room appears to have been prophylactic, and its astrological imagery part of an attempt to manipulate the influence of the stars through natural magic. So when you stand there, you receive all these beneficial rays from the planets and the stars. Cardinal Giulio followed in the footsteps of his cousin, and his predilection for astrology is well documented. I will only concentrate now with one very interesting element that shows that Giulio de' Medici had a special interest for sun, the astronomy, and natural magic. I will concentrate on this curious impresa that show that, like the garden, the solar imagery of the villa, this image is linked to the Pope's belief in celestial influence as expounded by Ficino. According to Paolo Giovio, who attributes its invention to the Pope's treasurer, the Florentine Domenico Buoninsegni, this impresa, made up of rays of sunlight passing through a crystal ball and burning everything that is not completely white. So its meaning was to proclaim the immaculate purity of his soul, capable of withstanding any evil. This device is to be found throughout the decoration of the villa. It appears, for example, 8 times and very prominently on the vault of the Sala di Giulio Romano. And also appears above the Fontana dell'Elefante. It's everywhere. Only a handful of scholars have noticed that such curious impresa derive from scientific experiments on the properties of reflection and refraction of sun rays. Although already in 1566, Girolamo Ruscelli linked this impresa to his own experiments on catoptric magic. André Chastel noted the close resemblance between the device and Leonardo da Vinci's experiments on the refraction of light with optical and astronomical applications. This link with science is evident in Gianfrancesco Penni's fresco in the Sala di Costantino, where the allegory of astronomy with the armillary sphere at her feet holds a crystal globe, while the three winched female figure write, carve, and paint the impresa and its motto. Here, the invention of Cardinal Giulio, the impresa, should be linked to the interests and experiments that were then developing around Archimedes' famous story of the burning mirrors used to set fire to the Roman ships in Syracuse, a story that constitutes a central episode in the history of optics and mathematics, from medieval Arab science, Alhazen here, to the 18th century with Buffon, for instance. One must also remember that from 1513 to 1516, Leonardo da Vinci, the new Archimedes, worked at the Villa Belvedere in the Vatican under the patronage of Pope Leo X's brother, designing burning mirrors to harness solar energy for the textile industry that the Pope hoped to develop in Rome. It is possible that his research led the Medici entourage to adopt these marvelous catoptric instruments as their own emblematic devices. And Leonardo himself had used the device in one of his mysterious allegories, now in the Louvre, in which we see this young man who uses a burning mirror to keep at bay fierce animals, generally interpreted as the passions. But in devising the Cardinal's impresa, Boninsegni replaced Archimedes' metallic mirror with a crystal sphere whose shape is reminiscent of the palla of the Medici. Now, this crystal sphere is a key image also in ancient astronomy. Plato, his followers, believed the universe was contained within a crystal sphere to which the stars were attached. So this is a fundamental principle of cosmology from Copernicus to Kepler and so on. But the sphere in the impresa here could be a more precise allusion to another of Archimedes' invention, his famous sphere or model of the universe, which, as we have seen, Ficino mentioned as an example of an imago astronomica alongside the planetary clock of Lorenzo della Volpaia. Moreover, in book 3 of Ficino's De Triplicia Viti, where he discusses the power of talismanic images, Archimedes' burning mirror is also mentioned. So we really have these two Archimedean inventions here that are fused within this very specific and political image. Here I give you this passage of Ficino. Astrologers think that propitious images have a similar power, by which they somehow change the nature and behavior of the wearer, restore him to a better state, so that he becomes now almost another person, or at least preserve him in good health for a very long time. They say that harmful images, however, possess against the wearer a poisonous and deadly force. Moreover, they say that images fashioned and directed for the ruin of some other person have the power of a bronze and concave mirror aimed directly at him, so that by collecting rays and reflecting them back at close range, they completely incinerate him, and even at long range, they make him blind. From this has arisen the story or belief which supposed that by the machination of astrologers and the witchcrafts of magicians, people, animals, plants can be planet-stricken and waste away. So this passage can help us better understand the magical and clearly apotropaic power that Renaissance men and women could attribute to images and objects. Read in the light of Ficino's natural magic, the Pope's impresa can be understood not so much as capable of attracting good heavenly influence as the plants and other objects in his garden and villa, but rather, like in Leonardo's drawing, as keeping evil forces at bay. And indeed, this is precisely the meaning that is given to the impresa by Giovio and Ruscelli, who write that the impresa was conceived during the short papacy of Adrian VI. So after the end of Leo X's papacy, there was Adrian VI, 1522-23. And during that time, everyone wanted to kill Cardinal Giulio. And so the idea is that this impresa is basically a talismanic protection against people that wanted to kill him. Interestingly, this is why also I believe there is this massive spread of the impresa everywhere in his apartments, not so much as a way of putting his stamp everywhere, but also possibly as a way to protect him from the evil. So to conclude Villa Madama, I must stress that I do not believe that a specific program was designed from the outset. Rather, what could be said is that the ideas developed by various artists and architects from the beginning of the project to the final stages of construction and decoration were in keeping with the villa's main function as a healthy, beneficial, and propitious retreat for the owner and their privileged guests. Although it remains impossible to determine whether the sundial was considered more than a beautiful and ingenious object, it was clearly part of a network of interconnected images and objects that reflected the Medici's interest in astronomy and astrology, and especially in harnessing celestial power for their own protection and benefit. So, in the studio of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, in the Palazzo Farnese at Caprarola, a small detail in the decoration shows an elephant saluting the moon with religious reverence. You now know all about the elephant in its astronomical hobby. But this is to say that the beliefs of the Farnese family were no different from those of the Medici a generation earlier. Pope Paul III, so Alessandro Farnese Sr., so Alessandro's grandfather, was also a student of Ficino in Florence. His astrologer, Luca Gaurico, predicted his patron's election, and when the prophecy came true, advised him to appoint his grandson a cardinal, then aged 14, based on his birth chart. Astrology was used in every aspect of daily life. Several documents also testify to the attention the cardinal paid to his health, especially at Caprarola, and particularly in relation to the environment. For example, I can quote a couple of letters from 1588, where we have this doctor, Vincenzo Remosetti, who attributes the epileptic seizure that had struck the cardinal the night before to la frigidità dell'aria di Caprarola, the cold air of Caprarola. A few days later, after the cardinal had undergone the most painful treatments and had finally fallen asleep, the doctor, concerned about the possible harmful effects of the moon on his convalescence, he advises him to avoid eat tutti i cibi frigidi et umidi e che evaporano al capo, all frigid and humid foods and evaporating to the head, in favor of meat of wild birds. This is good for you, chicken. The Farnese Palace at Caprarola is another splendid example of the fundamental belief in the correspondence between the macrocosm and the microcosm. and in the power of the stars over earthly things. A prominent scholar of astrological decoration, Mary Quinlan McGrath, has recently suggested that the great vault of the Sala del Mappamondo should be considered a talismanic imago astronomica in the Ficinian sense. Her hypothesis, which I will not discuss here, can be complemented and perhaps strengthened by observing the presence of other images and devices that insist on the connection between the villa, the environment, time, and the cosmos. And I will concentrate here especially on the sundials placed in the gardens, which have been completely ignored in the modern literature on the villa. So the disposition and decoration of the various apartments of the splendid pentagonal villa, of course, the pentagon is a very important geometrical figure with a lot of cosmological associations, but you really paid here close attention to environment. You have the summer apartment on the ground floor, who faces north, the winter apartment faces west, in strict correspondence with the two quadrangular secret gardens with whom they are connected. So you have the Giardino d'estate e le Giardino d'inverno. So the architect of the villa, Vignola, follows here the classical recommendations for the orientations of villas, which we already discussed. Furthermore, what's interesting at Caprarola is you also find 3 sundials on the various bastions, 1, 2, 3, and a mechanical clock. And these are dated from the time of the cardinal. And so it makes for a very complete apparatus in relation, of course, with the different directions and the measure of time. At the entrance to each of the drawbridges that gave access to these 2 separate gardens, 2 statues were placed, each with a polyhedral block on its head containing 3 sundials, making a total of 4 statues and 12 dials. These were sculpted by Giovanni Battista di Bianchi in the cardinal service since 1564 and installed in the gardens between 72 and 77. So they more or less coincide with the decoration of the Sala del Mappamondo, 73, 75. The addition of these statues was also part of the preparation for the visit of Pope Gregory XIII to Caprarola in 1578. Unfortunately, the lines and styles or gnomons that were used to indicate the hours are no longer visible. Originally, the lines were engraved on marble plaques. We still have some here, for instance, that covered the stone prisms. But was there a few days ago, only the statue to the left of the bridge leading to the summer garden still has a plaque with lines which are clearly visible, as well as the hole for the gnomon. I found several poems dedicated to these wonderful objects. Aurelio Orsi, the cardinal's court poet, marveled at the ability of these immobile sundials to capture the movement of the sun. It's not a particularly original poem, but I give it to you nonetheless. Sun, shed and style, edges and lines, accurately distinguish the hours and count the days. The sun hits the style creates the shadow. The edges receive it, the drawn line reveals the time. There is mobility and immutability in this arrangement. This fixed mechanism deciphers the unfixable riddle, and that riddle, of course, is the moving sun. The statues and their sundials were again mentioned in a poem of 1614, but in the 18th and 19th centuries, and of course 20th century, the original gnomonic function of these statues was no longer mentioned. In the sources I found, the 4 female figures were sometimes identified as the hours and sometimes as the seasons. And indeed, if you look carefully at the foot of each of the statues, there's a theatrical mask that recalls the decoration of the so-called Room of the Seasons, where each season is personified by a Pluto associated with zodiacal signs and a variety of attributes, including these very weird masks. In these images, the choice of young men, or erotes, personifying the seasons, and the theatrical mask derive from knowledge of ancient sculpture, namely the so-called season sarcophagus. I cannot really go into detail into that, but that's very much where it comes from. And so this shows that the internal decoration of the villa was conceived in strict relation with the outside garden, and especially the seasonal orientation of the villa. In his monumental work on the seasons and the hours, George Hanfmann recalls that the word hora was used by the Greeks to designate the seasons, but also female spirits or powers. The hours were the divinities that ensure the growth of plants and to prevent drought and epidemics. They were the cyclical goddesses of nature, so to speak. They derived their powers from their father, Zeus, the deity of time and often of agriculture. Homer saw these hours, the horae, as the guardians of Mount Olympus. Their significance as protectors of agriculture and gardens continues into classical times, where they were more clearly associated with the 4 seasons. These were determined based on the sun's cycle, with the solstices and equinoxes making it possible to divide its course into 4 distinct and measurable parts. For the Greeks, were no like 4 seasons. The 4 seasons derived from basically the geometrical image of the course of the sun. The 4 statues, thus, are both the hours and the seasons. As daughters of Jupiter and guardians of the Farnese gardens, they fit perfectly into the overall program, celebrating Cardinal Alessandro as a new Jupiter, master of time and the seasons. This identification appears throughout the villa. We find it in the Sala del Mappamondo, but here, of course, I show the room of Jupiter, which immediately follows the 4 rooms of the season. So here is, of course, Jupiter nursed by the goat Amalthea. And we also find the same iconography in the garden. One of the fountains that is now lost depicted the same episode. We have a document that shows that the terracotta group, which was to decorate a fountain of the goat Amalthean, was delivered in September 1562. And I found this very interesting drawing in the Bibliothèque nationale de France, where we can see this fountain and the magnificent pergolas also that adorned the garden. And so a couple of days ago, I was at Caprarola, and I realized that this drawing is exactly the same as another representation of that scene in the Sala dei Cigni. And I can only tell you this because I'm not actually quite sure what it means in terms of possibly the origin of this drawing that is so far unattributed. So I have to work more on that. Finally, the gnomonic statues reveal a clear interest in ancient sculptures. In this respect, it is quite possible that the choice of posing the statues with their arms raised to support the gnomonic blocks was inspired by the famous ancient statue of Atlas supporting the celestial sphere, which was acquired by the Farnese in the same year, 1562. One of the earliest depictions of the statue can be found in the lunette in the Sala dell'Aurora, the cardinal's bedroom. And in the same year, 1562, the cardinal also acquired a very valuable Roman calendar from the Del Buffalo collection, the Menologium Rusticum Colossianum. Looks very much like the first one I showed you at the beginning. Those are the 2 most precious ancient Roman calendars that are preserved today. And here, of course, it's further evidence of the Farnese family's interest in astrology and time measurement. In conclusion, in this conference, I wanted to show that the presence of sundials in early modern gardens is significant. Like the fountain, the labyrinth, the pergola, the aviary, you talked a lot about it here, the tennis court, the belvedere, the artificial mountain, the grotto, the nympheum, and so on. The sundial is an important element in the syntax of the Renaissance garden. And it is also a pivotal object, both spatially and symbolically. Also today it spoke a lot between art and science. And it is a reminder of the essential link between the garden, the wider environment, the microcosm and the macrocosm. The garden where medicinal plants were always cultivated to produce remedies was a place of healing, where the owners, often aging cardinals, hoped to restore their health and prolong their lives. Of course, plants were also cultivated according to the influence of the planets and the stars. This could be the subject of another conference. I will only mention one source that is very often quoted, a letter of 1541 by Jacopo Bonfadio. Is very often quoted because it's where he described his garden as a third nature, a mixing of nature and art. It's been quoted over and over in garden studies of the past decade. But the same attention has not been paid to the rest of his text, which equates simply the garden with the sky. But of gardens, of oranges, lemons, and cedars, of woods, olive trees, groves, laurels, and myrtles, of green pastures, of pleasant valleys and gentle hills, of streams and fountains, do not expect me to tell you any more, for this is an infinite work, as infinite as the innumerable stars of the eighth sphere, with which I believe this land has a correspondence. If things here below are to be believed to have a certain proportion to those above, since they depend on them. So I could have taken many more material here, but it's just to say that basically we need to also revisit part of the literature to recover that dimension. And this link between gardening and the study of celestial forces continues throughout Europe in the 17th and 18th century. I choose an example for Iris, Claude Monet, famous and very pragmatic treatise, Théâtre des Plants et Jardinage, written around 1615. It's very well known, especially for the beautiful parterre de broderie. But it is often forgotten that it also contains a treatise on astrology, suitable for all kinds of people, and especially for those involved in the cultivation of gardens. My French is nicer, but here we speak English. Of course, this astrological culture developed in many different ways. Not everyone was an ardent student of alchemy and astral magic like the Medici and the Farnese. And Mollet actually says that he got his astrological culture from his father. It was an oral tradition here, very different from the Medici and the Farnese, who were obviously extremely learned. Even the most conservative and least esoteric of cardinals, however, Cardinal Gabriele Paleotti, in his treatise on old age, the De Bono Senectutis, writes of gardens as the ideal place to cultivate one's body and soul in preparation for the afterlife. What I wanted to say is that basically this is a shared culture. It's very much a shared culture. Today, the French landscape and garden architect and philosopher Gilles Clément is one of the very few authors to have dealt, albeit very briefly, with this, I believe, fundamental aspect of garden and villa culture in a small chapter of his brief history of the garden entitled The Garden of the Stars. And rather than repeating the commonplace view that the early modern garden is an expression of man's domination over nature, which is not completely untrue, he emphasizes how the cosmic dimension of the garden, I quote him, places man in front of the universe, while the cosmos always interacts with living systems and places man in a state of dependence. paying attention to the sky means accepting to collaborate with the stars and abandoning any project of human domination over nature. End of quote, and thank you very much.